Hello everyone, this is the start of new tutorial series about inventory system. During this tutorial series we will create our own inventory system. We will create a widget to display our inventory, implement drag and drop, sort of inventory, and maybe we'll add something on a go. So let's start. Let's create a new folder somewhere in your project and let's call it inventory system. And let's open it up. Here let's create first a component for our inventory system. Right click on an empty space, create a blueprint class, actor component. Call it BPC inventory system. Next let's create a new structure. Right click on some empty space, blueprint and structure. This is gonna be a structure for a slot of our inventory. Let's call it S inventory slot. Now let's create a new structure for our data. Let's create a new structure S inventory item. Now let's open our S inventory item first. This is gonna be structure that will describe our item. First, every item should have an ID. Let's call it ID of type string. Next field is gonna be name of type name. Third one is gonna be thumbnail of type texture 2D. Next, let's add a variable called max stack size of type integer. And next, let's add a weight of type float. And one more thing is something like quality. Quality will mean, for example, for weapons, how durable your weapon is now, like it may be 100% or it's almost crushed, it's gonna be 10%, and for food it's gonna be a way how food looks like and tastes like. I mean, if it is already rotten or not. So it's gonna be a variable that we'll use for different cases. Also, let's create a new enumeration. Right click on an empty space, blueprint enumeration, and call it e item type. And let's open it. Here we're gonna store a type for our items, whether it is a weapon, armor, food, resources, or other, and save it. We can close eItem type and go back to S inventory item. And the last field here is gonna be item type of type E item type. Okay, I have a lot of E item type enumerations. Let me find which one I should use. Okay, now we can close S inventory item. Now let's open S inventory slot structure. This structure will hold an information about inventory slot. It will hold an info about what item is stored in it, how much of these items are stored in it, and I think that's all for now. So first is going to be item of type data table row handle. Second is gonna be mount of type integer, and third one is gonna be an ID of an item that is stored here of type string, and let's save it. Now let's create a list of our items that can be stored. Right click on an empty space and type data table. Here we have to select a structure that will be stored. It's gonna be our S inventory item. Let's call it DT inventory items and open it. Here we will have to provide a list of items that will be stored. Type on add button on the top part of a screen and you will see a new row. Call a new row as an apple, for example, and an ID is gonna be the same as a row name. They should be the same. Next, name of your item. For me, it's just gonna be an apple. Thumbnail. I don't have a thumbnail for an apple, so for test purposes, I'm gonna use just thumbnail for a berry. Max text size is gonna be 50. Weight of one berry is gonna be 0.1. Quality always 1 or 1 by default, and item type is gonna be food. Save it. And we can close this data table. Now we can open our inventory system. Let's create a new function here and call it create inventory. Let's add a few variables. First is gonna be slots count. Let's call it max slots count of type integer. Next is gonna be max weight of type float. Next is gonna be inventory of type S inventory slot. Not this one inventory slot. And it's gonna be an array. Compile and save. Now in create inventory, we're gonna add for loop. Get max slots count and plug it into a last index. First index is gonna be 1. Now for each iteration of a loop, we're gonna get our inventory and add a new element. Let's break this pin. Oops. Oh, not a break. Let's make this item. It's gonna be empty by default, so I think that we can just remove it. We should not make it. Now we will have an inventory full of empty slots. Now let's create a few functions. First is gonna be add item. Second is gonna be remove item. Third is gonna be find item. Well, let's start from an add item. Let's open it up, select function and add few inputs. First is gonna be ID. ID of an item that we're gonna add. Next is gonna be an amount. It's gonna be an integer. And now, first thing that we have to do, we have to find whether we already have a slot for such ID. So we have to implement function called find item. So our find item function should have a few inputs. First input is going to be an ID of an item. It's going to be gonna have type of a string. Next input is gonna be let's rename this function to find items. And this function will return us an array of slots with this item. And then we will have a little bit more functions. So here let's get an inventory and make a for each loop with break. From here we're gonna break our array element and check if this ID equal exactly to an ID of an input of find items. Let's get ID. Here we're gonna add a branch, and if it is true, then we have to, this slot is gonna be one of the returned slots. Let's create a new local variable here and call it local slots. Let's get them right after a branch and add a new value here. If true, we're adding this for loop element. Next, when a loop is completed, we're just gonna return this array slots of type s inventory slot of an array. Also, don't forget to make it an array and plug local slots here. Compile and save. Now let's select this function and add a category right on the right side of the screen in the details panel and name it searching. Let's make this function pure. Just tick pure here. And let's create a new function. Let's call it find item find slots to store. Move it into searching. Let's make it a private function, or to make it private, on the right side of the screen in details panel on access specifier select a private. Now select a function and add an input. We're gonna have two inputs. First is gonna be slots through which we will search. Second is gonna be ID. Oh, not an ID, amount of items, integer, and make it single. And third is gonna be ID of an item of type string. Let's move ID to the top and slots to the bottom. Well, this function will find us slots that we need to store our items. We need this function, for example, if we have an inventory with a lot of slots and two of them are apples. First slot has 50 apples on a max stack size. Second has 40 apples, almost on the max stack size, but it can store 10 more. And we want to store 20 apples. So this function will return us a second slot on which we can store 10 apples, and it will return us a new empty slot where we will store our other 10 apples. So now for each slot here, we're gonna break it. We don't need an ID, by the way. Let's remove it from an inputs. We are breaking a slot and checking if an amount is already on maximum stack size. To get maximum stack size, we have to get an information for our item. Let's get an item here and break it. Here we'll have a data table and row name. So let's get a data table and call find, oh not find, row get data table row, and plug row name to row name. Right after that, we have to get an infos from this row. So let's break it, and we have to define which structure we are breaking. We are breaking as inventory item. Here we have to check whether a max text size is not equal to an amount that is already stored. So that will mean that we still can store something in this slot. It's not full. Let's create a new variable and call it storable amount left. And let's make its type as integer and make it a single object, not an array. If true, here hold B button on your keyboard and left click somewhere to add a branch. Plug this condition, this boolean, into node of a branch. So if slot still has some place, then it's gonna be one of the slots that we're gonna return. Let's create a new local variable and call it local slots of type as inventory slot and make it an array. Here we're gonna get this local slots and add a new element here. This is gonna be an element from a for each loop. Okay, I have a wrong as inventory slot structure. If false, if false, we're just continue looping through an array. Well, right after that we have to get storable amount left and subtract a value that we're gonna put in this slot, and the value is gonna be max text size minus an amount of items that are already stored in this slot. This is gonna be a left capacity of this slot. And now we have to check whether we can store whole amount in this slot. To do it, we're gonna subtract from this capacity and amount to store. We're gonna just add a new pin here, subtract, and get amount. And this subtraction will return us an items that can be stored. So let's subtract this value from storable amount left. Let's clamp this value because it can be negative. Minimum is gonna be 0, maximum is gonna be max text size. And set storable amount left to this value. And we should have a default value for storable amount left because by default it is 0 already. Right here before for each loop we're gonna set storable amount left to an amount. Right after that we have to check if storable amount left is already 0. So we found enough slots to store this amount of items. Let's check if it is 0. And if true, then we're gonna break from this loop. But to break from this loop, we have to replace it with not just for each loop, with break. So delete this loop. And replace it with for each loop with break. And connect everything back. Now, on completed, we have to return node. We're gonna return slots. No, we don't have to return yet. We have to check whether we have an empty slot if a storable amount is still not 0. First, let's plug true of this branch to a break of a loop. Now here on completed, we're gonna add a sequence. Let's move it a little bit below all the everything here. Now we have to check on a first execution node of a sequence if storable amount left is 0. Let's check if it is 0. So we were able to store everything. If true, we are doing nothing. If false, we have to find an empty slot in our inventory, and it will be one of slots that will contain this amount of items. So in searching, let's create a new function and call it find empty slots. Move it into searching section. Here we're gonna get our inventory and loop through it for each loop. Let's break an item and check if an amount is equal to 0. Let's create a new local variable and call it local slots. We're gonna get them, and if an amount in the slot is 0, we're gonna add this slot to an array of empty slots. Now add the return node here. Add a new output called slots of type S inventory slot and make it an array, and plug local slots to a return node. Let's go back to our flying slots to store, and here we have to call find empty slots. Let's make this function pure, select it here or on the left panel and make it a pure. Well, now right after we have got an empty slots, we have to find how much of empty slots do we need to store an amount left. So let's add a for each loop with break for them. And if storable amount is equal to 0, we should plug a for each loop into false statement. And right after that, we have to know about max stack size of items that we need to store. We're getting them here from get data table row, and let's promote it to a local variable here before a branch. Or no, we don't have to promote it to a local variable because we cannot guarantee that we will enter this for loop. So And we will also not be able to guarantee that slots array here is not empty. So we have to provide an ID for an item that we're finding slot for. So let's add an ID parameter of type string and make it a single object. Now here, before for each loop for finding empty slots, let's get data table row. Data table is going to be dt items, or how have we called it? Inventory items. And the role name is going to be an ID of an item we're searching for. So let's get ID. And plug it into a row name. It will be automatically converted into a name. So right after that, we're gonna break a row, and we only need max text size. So let's, on the right side, in details panel for this structure, let's unpin everything except max text size. Like this. And connect row found to a for each loop. Well, now we have to get our storable amount left and subtract a max text size from it. Then we have to clamp it between 0 and max text size. Or not. No, I'm sorry, we don't have to clamp it between max text size, not here and not here. We have to clamp it between an amount. So max is gonna be get amount here, copy it and plug it here into clamp max value. So right after that we will have a new storable amount left. Let's set it. And let's add this slot to local slots. Let's get local slots and add this one. Next we're gonna check whether if our storable amount left is equal to 0. Let's get it and check if it is equal to 0. Add a branch. And if it is equal to 0, we're breaking from a loop. Now back to our sequence. Finally, at the end one of a sequence, let's add a return node. And we're gonna return these slots. Let's get them here, and we will return also storable amount left. Because sometimes we cannot store every item. For example, if your inventory left capacity is 50 and you're trying to pick up 100 apples, you have to store only 50 and you're trying to pick up. If your capacity is 100 and you're trying to pick up 200 apples, you have to add to inventory only 100 apples. And you should tell somewhere to maybe interaction system or your player that you were able to pick up only 100 and 100 still left on an earth or in a chest or somewhere. So on the return node, let's add an output and call it stored amount, or just like collected amount of type integer and slots, out slots of type as inventory slot, and connect everything and make as inventory slots an array, not a single object. And collected amount is gonna be get amount minus amount left. Get amount minus amount left, and plug it into collected amount. Compile and save. Let's open add item function. Right here we're gonna call find slots to store and find items. We are searching for an items with such ID and plugging it here in find slots to store. Plug in ID here, amount here. This function will return us slots where we have to store this amount of items. Now, for each of them, for each of slots, we're gonna break a slot. Also, we have to get data table row of dt inventory items and connect an ID to a row name. Let's get ID connected to a row name so that we will know a maximum stack size. Let's break as inventory item, disable every pin except max stack size, and before everything here, let's promote an amount to be added to a local variable and call it local left amount left. Now here we can get a max stack size minus an amount that is already stored in this slot. And we will know how much items we have to store in this slot. Get local amount left minus this value. So for example, if first slot already has 40 apples and maximum is 50, we will count here that we can add only 10 apples to this slot. Well, right after that, we have to get our inventory and call find. Plug this item of an array in this find function. This is how we will find an index of a slot that we gonna change. Now let's get an inventory and set array element. Plug execution node from row found to this set array element function. Plug an index as a result of a find function. Before this we have to set a local amount left. We just subtracted it. Let's set it. So the value will be updated. And we have to set an item. Let's make as inventory slot. ID is gonna be get ID. And amount is gonna be amount plus this value. So we're gonna get this amount plus values that we have added. Also, we cannot ensure that if we have 10 apples to add, we don't know if we can add so much apples. So here, before, right after first minus, unplug everything here, move everything to the right, and we have to find a minimum between this and local amount left. Because, for example, if there was only one apple left to add, then we should not add 10 apples to fill a stack, we should only add one, and plug this minimum to this subtraction node. Right after that, this minimum goes here, and this plus operation result goes here. Now let's connect an item. Item is gonna be this one that we have found in a data table row. Let's make it. Connect data table. Where is it? No, we should not connect it. Let's select the data table, dt, inventory items, and the role name is gonna be copied, just copy an ID that is already converted to a name and plug it into a row name. Compile and save. So this function will add us an inventory items. We will continue in the next video in which we will add a user interface to represent our inventory.